I'm really pleased that we're joined by Anna Lührmann, who is a current member of the Bundestag, indeed the youngest ever parliamentarian in Germany, but also an academic and a political scientist who bridges the world of politics and academia. To my immediate right, Professor Petra Schleiter, Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Oxford. To my left, Carsten Holtkamp, who is Director for Corporate and Public Affairs at Kreab worldwide. And to my far left, last but not least, Lora, Viola, who is a Professor of Political Science in the John F. Kennedy Institute at the Freie Universität. This is a panel that's been convened jointly by the Berlin University Alliance and the University of Oxford in the context of our exciting partnership between Oxford and Berlin on the research and the university front. Before we turn to our brilliant panel, I just want to contextualize why we're here, as if it needs any introduction. Some 35 years ago, on my island, I was a 9-year-old watching events in Berlin unfold on my television. And I think it was at that point I had an awareness, for the first time perhaps, that not everyone in the world had the same freedoms that perhaps I had taken for granted, freedoms that perhaps existed more so on my island then than now. But indeed, that context is sobering when we think about events of this week. We've seen the US presidential elections, and we've seen some 71 million people vote Donald Trump in as president. And for some people, those who supported him, this is a manifestation of democracy. For others, it's a sign of the erosion of democracy. And in Germany this week, we've seen, in a very different context, the collapse of the government. We'll touch on those issues, but we want to situate them in a broader context. And indeed, 2024 has been super election year. We've seen national elections, regional elections across the globe. And the balance sheet in terms of the rise of authoritarian populist nationalism is somewhat in the balance. In France, the national rally led by Jordan Bardella and Marine Le Pen came close to succeeding in those elections, thwarted by a coalition on the left. Elsewhere, we see populist nationalists succeeding. Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. And around the world, beyond the European context, we can look to leaders like Xi, Modi, Putin, perhaps Netanyahu and Orban, as leaders who represent values that many of us might see as on the far right, and in some cases, in tension with the principles and values of democracy. But it's not just about elections. It's about values, it's about institutions, it's about the whole of society. Our media, the way we communicate across society, the rule of law, public attitudes and trust in democracy. Those are some of the themes that I hope we'll explore and be able to understand at a deeper level what's going on and how we can address the challenge to liberal democracy. So I'm going to start, if I may, with you, Anna, and we'll go across the panel and just ask you to introduce yourself and how you see this challenge in the broadest possible way and how you situate yourself within it, given the perspective you represent in politics, research, or business and strategic communications. Anna.
Thank you. Well, I think this week I have as many questions as all of you in this room. I see many question marks on your faces because it is indeed a week where we see in what kind of difficult waters democracy is currently. And for me, sort of from an analytical perspective, there are two strands. One is that I think sort of we as Democrats, now with a small d, we have to understand that many of our citizens don't feel represented by democratic politics at the moment. And this is really, I think, something that we have to understand much better of how we can find ways of communication, ways of addressing issues, ways of solving issues that speaks more to the hearts of more of the electorate in our countries. I think that's the number one task. So this is a challenge for, now I'm mainly a politician, so for us as democratic politicians, that we really have to get better at. That's number one. But number two is also, which is maybe equally true, maybe to a lesser extent, it's for you out there who do the research to put some numbers on this. The other side is also fighting with unfair means. And we have to understand that, and we have to get better at fighting back. I mean, we currently live in a world where most of the young people in Germany, but I think in most democracies, get their news and social interaction on a platform controlled by China. Most of the political elites communicate on a platform controlled by Elon Musk. I mean, this is ridiculous. How can we allow countries like China and tech giants to set the rules of how freedom of speech is organized these days? This needs to change. We need to have democratic, rule of law-based frameworks for the areas where we organize our freedom of speech. Otherwise, it comes under attack. So these are just two thoughts. One, democratic politicians we need to do a better job. And two is we need to have an end of the naivety and get better at organizing freedom of speech in a way that's up to the 21st century.
Very clear. Petra.
Thank you, Alex. So I'm a political scientist, and I come at this topic from the angle of research. I'd say for researchers, this is one of the defining challenges of our time. And that's because if democracy backslides, we're very unlikely to make good progress on other big challenges that face us, including climate change. So according to Freedom House, democracy is now backsliding in every region of the world. And the re-election of Trump as a twice impeached president who incited a violent insurrection is likely to accelerate that process. Now, backsliding, maybe I'll just say a little bit about that, because it's democratic backsliding is different from the reversals of democracy that we've seen in the past through coups. It's a gradual process by which elected politicians first polarize the public to justify their actions, then unstitch the checks and balances on their power. And we really know that we are in trouble when they begin to attack the freedom and fairness of elections and our rights and freedoms. So in this year of pivotal elections, and Alex, you've already said that a little bit, we've seen populist authoritarianism strengthened. We've seen it strengthened in Europe, in the European Parliament, in Austria, in France, and now in the US. And now we're for the first time, in a sense, in a situation in which democracy is under attack in its historic heartlands, so in Europe and in the US. And that matters because we know that populist authoritarians don't hesitate to resort to violence or repression in order to seize power or hold on to it. And we saw that with the insurrection that Trump incited at the Capitol in 2021. But we've also seen it play out fully in Hungary under Orban, in Poland under the previous government. And so that is really the challenge that we're facing. We're at an inflection point, I think, in this global competition between democracy and authoritarianism. It's a moment of severe challenge, I think, for democratic systems, and we need to think about how we can do a better job. And for me as a researcher, I'd say it's not just a challenge for research, but it's a challenge on which we need to work together across politics, research, business, NGOs, and international organizations.
Fantastic. Thank you, Petra. Carsten.
Well, thanks for having me. As a public affairs consultant in a global consultancy, my angle is the business side of democracy under stress, and I can clearly say that when democracy is under attack, it forms quite severe challenges to business and to companies in terms of their operations, the reputation, as well as their long-term sustainability, and maybe even existence. Let me please outline 5 of them briefly. First of all, economic instability and uncertainty, as it is democratic institutions that provide for the right framework. And if those institutions are weakened, uncertainty arises, which is not exactly a booster for investments, needless to say. Second, it would be the regulatory risks that come about when society shift away from a democratic system into arbitrary changes that likely occur, posing quite some efforts to mitigate them. Thirdly, it's legal uncertainty, as it is democratic institutions that provide for the rule of law. And the rule of law is essential for any contractual contracts, as well as for the guarantee of property. That is pivotal, absolutely. Thirdly, corruption and unfair competition. That is a very likely thing that arises when systems shift away from democratic to undemocratic systems. And last but not least, 5 would be, we're right in the middle of it, sanctions and unfair or imbalanced trade restrictions, which can lead up to supply chain issues. Those are just 5 of them, and out of those evolve certain responsibilities for corporate leaders, which I would like to discuss later on with you, but that would be my take from the business side of things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for organizing this panel, indeed, in this momentous week. I thought I'd start by thinking about the title of our panel, Democracy Under Attack. I think, this image of democracy under attack evokes an idea of an epic battle, a showdown. And in fact, I think Kamala Harris, toward the end of her campaign, tried to use this image to motivate voters. She gave one of her last speeches at the Ellipse where Donald Trump had given his speech on January 6th before rioters stormed the Capitol. And, Donald Trump gave her plenty of fodder to evoke this image, right? He talked about shooting Liz Cheney. He talked about his political opponents as enemies from within. So Kamala Harris really, at the end, leaned into this idea of democracy under attack in this very visual way, this very explicit and direct way. And yet, the voters didn't buy it. The voters were not motivated by this idea or this fear that democracy is really literally under attack. And I think, we have enough surveys to know that voters actually care a lot about democracy. It's not that they want to get rid of democracy. It's not that they would agree with attacking democracy, but they weren't convinced that democracy is in this under this imminent threat. And I think that tells us something about the nature of democratic backsliding and the challenge we're dealing with. First of all, we know from all indicators that the United States has been experiencing democratic backsliding, and it has been experiencing that over several years, and it's not just Trump. But what we also know is that the process of democratic backsliding, as Petra has already said, is a gradual and an incremental one primarily. It is based on the erosion from within, the use of democratic institutions and rules themselves. That means extension of executive power. That means using the courts and the judiciary to adjudicate political issues. That means through legislation. That means through the electoral process itself, in the name of securing the integrity of elections, to actually undermine them with things like voter suppression. And I think that this erosion of democracy with the tools of democratic institutions and processes makes it much more difficult to identify, makes it more difficult to call it out, and it also makes it much more difficult to stop it. And I think this is what we're looking at going forward in the Trump term, is that he will be using institutions that citizens recognize as democratic institutions to undo many of those democratic rights that we have. And I think that is really the nature of the challenge right now. It's not the spectacular attack, but it really is this gradual, incremental change.
Thank you. What a terrific set of opening statements. Let's now dig a little bit deeper. I think we'll start on the problem side, and then we'll hopefully move more optimistically towards possible solutions at the institutional and societal level, hopefully. Lora, maybe we could come back to you. In terms of what you've seen in the US, you work a lot on US politics. I think for the rest of the world, a lot of people have been caught by surprise that Trump could win again, in spite of everything that's happened, the indictments, etc., in the interim. People are surprised, particularly in Europe. But in the US, there are claims that, well, this is democracy. He won the majority of the vote share, as well as coming out well of the Electoral College system. You've highlighted this idea of almost denialism, an unawareness of what's going on. How have we got to that point where an academic like you looks at the context and sees democratic backsliding, but so many people seem unaware of that within the US?
Yeah, so I think one of the first lessons that we have to take away from this election is that Donald Trump is not an anomaly. He's not a marginal figure. He's not an aberration. And even though, I get many questions here in Germany about, who could vote for that man? Do you know anyone who votes for Trump? And the answer is I do. Many people, because many, many people vote for him. And in fact, if you look at one of the most remarkable results of this election, it is that across a variety of demographics, across a variety of levels of elections, the country has moved right. Right? This is not a marginal figure at all. And I think that we need to consider that we're looking at not just, if we step back, right, it's a little too soon to say, but Biden will be the exception and not Trump going forward. And so, of course, the question is, how do we come to this point? One issue is to recognize that we're here and not to have our own denialism because we think, how could it be? This is what we're looking at. But I think another really important point is when you think about democratic backsliding being this gradual and incremental process, when people go to the polls, they don't necessarily feel like they have a choice between democratic principles or their policy choices or their party. And that's not how they see what they're voting for. And in particular, in a very highly polarized context like the United States, the idea that you need to support your partisan group, the policies of your party, overshadows more abstract ideas that if you vote for the other side, or that you might be actually helping to defend a larger, more abstract principle that you also depend on. So I think there's this disconnect between, and I think it's due to a highly polarized environment between, voting for what you think your partisan interests are versus voting for a larger abstract concept like democracy. And I think Kamala Harris wasn't able to make that point. She tried to, but it didn't come to the voters.
Fantastic. Anna, could I come to you? I mean, the other big visible event this week has been the collapse of the German government. It's extraordinary and wonderful that you've made it here. I can only imagine what a busy week you have had.
And that I'm still standing, I'm surprised myself, yes.
Where are we in Germany in relation to these broader questions? I mean, is this week just coalition politics as normal, or does it point to broader systemic challenges that are relevant here in Germany as well?
No, it's definitely not normal to end a coalition in a week where the whole world is looking for actually orientation, for stability, and is looking to the largest economy of the European Union to provide that, and then to say, okay, no, I'm not ready to compromise, which is what Christian Lindner has been doing on Wednesday, and we'd rather end this coalition. So I don't think it's normal. I think we need now politicians that are actually ready to lead and ready to take on responsibility. And in a democracy, that always means that you have to be ready to form compromises. And that was lacking this week. And I find that very unfortunate because, this is, I don't think, a good sign for our democracy. But now we are there, and now I think it will be a hopefully fair election campaign, hopefully brief, and hopefully with a clear result. Because one of the reasons for this coalition to have so many problems was indeed that it was a coalition of three very, very diverse partners. And this is, I think, one of the effects that this rise of the far right has in a country with a proportional voting system like Germany, that coalition formation becomes increasingly difficult. So this is, in a way, also a consequence of the rise of the far right. And we also, and I really hope that we'll be able now, after the campaign, to have a clear majority with a government that is able to show to people that actually democratic politics can deliver and respond to their problems.
And I suppose it speaks very much to this theme that when the far right sets out certain policies, all the mainstream parties position in relation to that and need much clear ways of messaging and distinguishing themselves, and then compromise becomes much harder.
Yes, also, and here I found it very interesting to see that actually in the US, apparently, when in these questions of what was your most important issue to consider in the elections, migration actually didn't go as high as many would have expected. But here in Germany, I think the clear issue that the far right is trying to mobilize on is the migration issue. So I think here it's important that democratic parties show that they're able to address the problem, but also that we really talk about the issues that matter to people. And again, I emphasize again, we are in a different information environment at the moment. So I think we really need to wake up to what is happening out there and understand that if we want to have, I mean, I don't have to tell sort of the scientists, or all of you as scientists here in this room, that how critical independent pluralistic media is for the formation of the opinion of the electorate, actually. And if that is manipulated, if that is skewed, that really endangers the democratic process. So we have to do something about that.
Great, thank you. And Carsten, in terms of the business perspective, you work with organizations that probably see all of the challenges you outlined. They need stability, they need certainty, markets need good governance and democracy, otherwise companies are going to struggle. How is it that we've got to a point where our democratic structures seem to almost be ignoring the needs that businesses and organizations have? What's led to this point?
That's a tough one, frankly. What has led to that point? Maybe it's that frog in the bowl, and it's been heating up for decades, probably. And maybe it's about blending out certain realities. I mean, this discussions about the end of growth and the end of times and the no future debate is from the 1980s. Then we had the 1990s as an intermezzo, so to say, where the belief in progress, modern progress, was revived again. And now we're back there where we see the limits to growth and maybe also to societies as they are formed with the rise of emerging markets and everything. How has that led? It's been a process of probably denial on both sides, politics and business, playing games for a tactical competitive edge on short-term perspective. In a competitive world, I mean that there are certain logics of activities that are in those systems, in the political systems, the orientation in voting terms, in quarters. How this is really impeding a long-term strategy. So that would be my take.
And Petra, sort of finally on this sort of diagnostic side, in terms of that process of democratic backsliding, how is it that elected politicians are able to adopt those tactics and strategies in a way that, as we've heard, almost appears to be by stealth, and we almost realize too late?
Mm-hmm. So research has been really helpful in diagnosing why this is happening. And we see both in the US and here in Europe that support for democracy is fraying precisely because of what Anna was saying, namely because too many voters believe that democracy is not delivering for them. There are many reasons for that, but two really big ones are rising inequality. So we've had the 2008 economic crisis, we've had the pandemic, we've had the cost of living crisis, which in the US election was very important, nearly 30% inflation since 2019. That's doing two things. It's creating a lot of precarity for some voters, and it's also opening up, very interestingly, an intergenerational inequality gap. So it hits younger people much more than older people. The second thing that's been happening is that sociocultural status hierarchies are being challenged. So the racial hierarchies are being challenged by immigration. In the US, also by increasing racial equality. And gender hierarchies are being challenged by increasing gender equality. And that is why, for many voters, there's a real resonance in this claim that democracy essentially serves rich, corrupt, woke elites. And the underlying phenomenon here is that too many people believe democracy is not going to deliver a better future for them. And so what democratic politicians, I guess, need to do, and research is also really good in showing us that, is they need to demonstrate that they can actually deliver. And I think one of the difficulties that democratic politicians have had in fighting against populist authoritarians is they've relied too much on the assumption that people will allocate the top priority to democracy, and that there is a consensus, a normative consensus, that democracy is a really good thing and maybe the most important thing ahead of all sorts of other things. And that, I think, we can't take for granted.
Yeah. That's quite sobering and quite a pessimistic picture. So let's turn to the solution side of the equation. Staying with you, Petra, you work very much on institutions. What can we fix through the reform of our institutions? I mean, if a lot of this is about opinion, if a lot of this is people starting to be convinced that democracy is just for woke elites, and actually there are other ways of delivering politics, what can we fix? Is it about tinkering with our rule of law? Is it about passing legislation? Where do our formal and informal institutions at a political level have a role to play, and what can we do?
Really good question. So I've got a colleague here in Berlin who's called Dan Sieblatt, and he always says we need to think short term and long term. There's some things that we can do in the short term to strengthen our democracies, and actually Germany is thinking in this way and strengthening its constitutional court currently, which is a helpful thing. In the longer term, I think we need to confront this crisis of democracy head on. And there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that Pew Center polls show that the majority of populations in democracies think that democracy is a good thing in principle. 70 to 80% of people agree that democracy is a good thing in principle. But they're dissatisfied with their specific institutions and politicians. And so the task that we have is to essentially instill more trust in the institutions that we have. We know exactly from research what does that. We know how we can help people trust decision processes. We know how we can help people have faith in the democratic decisions that are taken. And we know that we need to make democratic processes more inclusive, more participatory, more deliberative, and we need to give people more influence on actual decisions that affect them. Now, there is a huge amount of experimentation with this, including in Germany. So you will be aware of civil society organizations that are running citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, collaborative governance. There are many, many initiatives. One of the issues is that that amazing amount of experimentation is not very well joined up with what we know about how these institutions need to be designed and how they need to interface with mainstream policy processes. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why adoption into mainstream policy processes has not been great. So this is another area in which we're really sort of challenged to work together across politics and science and civil society.
Fantastic. And it's not just about national institutions, it's also about international institutions. And Lora, you work a lot on international institutions, including their relationship to democracy. What needs to emerge at the international level? We also hear in the context of democracy being under threat that our global liberal order is under threat. The international institutions that create norms and standards of effective governance around the world are arguably broken and not fit for purpose. Are there things we can think about at that level that can restore democracy?
It's somewhat ironic that the standard institutions of the international order at the moment were created as a result of a previous era of crisis, as a solution to that crisis, right? Protectionism, war, health crises. We have these an effort at international cooperation that's institutionalized in organizations in order to deal with those. And yet now, in our moment of what some people call a polycrisis, we have democratic backsliding at the domestic level affecting also these international institutions. So populists are anti-globalists many times. They take these international institutions as a place to argue to their constituencies that we're going to work against this globalist elite. And so, we see Brexit, for example, working against the idea of an EU. We see Trump having pulled out of the highest number of international organizations the United States were pulled out of under Trump. So we have really a weakening of these international institutions as a corollary to democratic backsliding domestically, right at a moment when international cooperation might be actually most needed and most helpful. So here's a real dilemma. And on top of that, and this is the bad news, international organizations like the UN, like the WTO, are not good at reforming. It's been on the agenda for decades, and it's not happened, and it won't happen. And so we really have a deadlock situation there. What has happened is that countries have responded slightly differently by circumventing these international organizations and by forming so-called clubs of common interest, like-minded groupings of actors. And on the one hand, this might be a small area of promise where those countries that see the same on a certain issue, like climate, can move ahead on those issues together. On the other hand, this also leads to a fragmentation of the international order and maybe even a polarization that might ultimately also underline those overarching goals of trying to get together to solve these crises.
And Anna, you bring not only the national perspective, but also arguably a global perspective. You've done extraordinary work in Sudan. You've been Minister of State within the Foreign Ministry. How does what we see close to home resonate also around the world? What does that picture of institutional crisis look like on a global scale? Do you see this playing out beyond Europe, beyond North America?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked this question are these wonderful people in Georgia that are fighting so hard to get their country to come on a democratic pathway. And I think this is something that we also have to remember, that democracy is something that sometimes we need to fight for, and that people around the globe are also still fighting for. And I think I listened very carefully to what you said, because it felt very much in the line of my last publications as a researcher 5 years ago, that ended basically also with the statement, well, democratic politicians need to deliver better. And then I decided to run for office and realized it's not that easy. But actually, I think this whole delivery thing is just a bit paternalistic. Because in the end, if you break it down, what are we doing as politicians? We have collective problems. We had the corona pandemic. We now have Putin gone wild and attacking another country. We have economic crisis. The German business model doesn't work anymore because China is getting smarter. So we have, as societies, huge problems and need to address them as societies. And then if you just sit there at home and you're like, okay, which politician now is going to solve that issue for me? That's not going to work, right? I mean, if we were in a smaller scale, like a family or something, we would say, okay, well, we are attacked. We have our way of earning income doesn't work. So what do each and every one of us actually is doing to chime in to make sure that we are competitive, that we're secure, that we have a basis for our future, right? So I think sort of one very smart German, or actually two smart German scholars and journalists published a book this summer, and they said we need to treat everyone more as grown-ups. And I think that might be more an answer, that we need to come to a way to understand that the crisis is the new normal at the moment for the West, and that we all need to do our share. And we also, and my final point here, we also need to understand that we cannot take democracy for given, but that we need to work to defend it. And that's also a new experience for most of us.
This is a really nice segue to the final area I want us to explore, which is about solutions at the societal level as well, a responsibility for all of us. And Carsten, I think you come from that business perspective, and I'm really interested in what shared responsibility you think business has and how business can be part of the solution in this space.
Yes, I believe there's a strong role that business can take, and I would take up Anna's last point, not taking democracy for granted. And this is actually an angle where business can do quite a bit. The good story now on the solution path is that companies, employers enjoy a high level of confidence among people. There's this Edelman Trust Survey, the latest one, and corporates, if it's your employer, it scores much higher than, let's say, NGOs or the government or so. That means companies are in a fairly good position to retrain democratic processes, and in this fragmented society and world, it's maybe one of the few left places where, let's say, discursive conflict resolution can succeed, as people need to resolve problems, and not because they are benevolent, but as a cause of their own, because they need to conduct business. Okay, and coming from that angle, my plea would be, and I see that taking place also in companies, to invest into exactly these skills. As a CEO, you need to equip your leadership staff with conflict resolution methods in order for them to be strong and to withhold an argument. What are you going to do as a leader and as a team leader if somebody comes up and says, yeah, this deportation thing is the right thing, from the river to the sea is a very good slogan. How do you react? And how do you manage, how do you moderate a conflictual situation on your team? And this is actually democracy at work, providing good experiences with democracy. That would be something that companies can do, besides, of course, being more vocal in the public eye. And this has happened a lot, especially since the latest EU elections, when CEOs became much more vocal and really addressing the challenges that I've outlined already. And I think there a certain process of pondering has started, and I hope that the latest developments will fuel that path, and I can only encourage companies to join programs like what the Hertie Foundation does, to really engage in fostering democracy. It's important and it's vital.
And it's brilliant that you're doing this work to say businesses benefit from democracy, businesses need to speak out on behalf of democracy.
Sure.
Petra, you come from a research perspective. What can researchers and universities do to avoid the democratic backsliding that you've described?
So maybe I can speak here about the University of Oxford and what it's currently doing, because this is an area in which it is launching a very big initiative. So the university has decided that this is such an important problem that it wants to bundle its research expertise and its extraordinary convening power by establishing a Center for Democratic Resilience. That center works at 4 levels because we think that resilience of society is linked across societies, institutions, the international level, and we also observe what's happening in authoritarian regimes, and that is because that is where the authoritarian playbook is being developed and refined. We work with practice, so with politics, with businesses, with NGOs, in policy labs that give us the flexibility to address practical problems quickly. And so this is kind of the work that we're doing to move ahead on democratic resilience. You asked earlier about societal resilience, I think, and maybe I can just illustrate with that example how we work. So on that topic, one of the really striking things that's happened this year is that we've seen in the European elections, in the US elections, that populist authoritarians are increasingly popular amongst the youngest cohort of voters. Now, this is extraordinary because in the past, this has always been the most progressive cohort of voters, reliably. So this would be an incredible reversal, and it also doesn't it's worrying when you think about the future of democracy. So what can we do as researchers on that front? Well, we can work with governments and government public policy teams and non-profit consultants that work with the public sector to think about how do we diagnose this problem with precision, and then we can bring our expertise in terms of methods and techniques to bear in actually analyzing how this problem has come about and how it's playing out and what can be done about it. So for instance, you do need expertise to analyze big data, to understand the social media environments in which people are immersed. You need expertise to run cross-national surveys to actually understand how this cohort is thinking across different countries. And to me, one of the examples of what we can achieve when we work in partnership, say with business and with government, that is really compelling is the Oxford-AstraZeneca partnership to develop the COVID-19 vaccine. We can achieve a lot in a very short time if we really focus our resources. And that's how the university has now decided to bundle its resources and focus on strengthening democracy.
Amazing. Lora, also from an academic perspective, what do you see as the role that universities and research can contribute in this space?
Well, I think everything Petra just said is very exciting. I want to just highlight a slightly different angle, and that is, I already said that democratic backsliding seems to be worsened under conditions of polarization, and the United States is a prime example of that. But another thing that research shows is that political polarization seems to be associated also with a broader crisis of epistemic authority. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there's a lot of uncertainty about what do we know, how do we know it, and who gets to decide what we know. Mm-hmm. And I think that as scientists, as academics, as experts, we're on the defensive at the moment. There's misinformation, there's conspiracy theories, alternative facts that are on the rise. So I think we have a real responsibility as scientists, as academics, as universities to step up on this issue. And I think what we need to do is something different than what we've done in the past. That means, not be in the ivory tower, not act as elitists, but engage with society and try to build a bridge to the public. And in Scripps, which I'm representing here today, an Exzellenzcluster at the Free University, we are starting a new project on science communication. And the idea there is to think about how experts can engage with the public, build a bridge to the public, and communicate with the public, and draw on the pluralism within science to do that. And we can see that this mattered very much over the last few years with respect to, it's great that universities are helping to drive vaccine development, but we also need experts to explain why vaccines might be a good thing, right? And to push back against some of the false narratives that are out there. But how do we do that? And how do we do that well? And how do we do that without being paternalistic? Mm-hmm. And that's some of the research that we're starting now to do.
Brilliant, really exciting. I think as universities and academics, we need to connect much more closely to the public and communicate what we do so that it has impact. Anna, and finally, from the coalface of politics, what do you see from that bottom-up, non-paternalistic perspective as the exciting things that you're seeing in society that might offer the green shoots of restoring democracy?
Well, I mean, the most exciting thing, of course, is that the majority of citizens in Germany is strongly rooted for democracy, comes out to the street to do that, in personal interaction comes out to do that. So I think we need to, this gives me great optimism, great hope, of course. Second, when it comes to fighting disinformation, then I think here the important thing is that first, I mean, people have become much more aware of it now. And together with experts, I think we need to work really also on using technology to recognize and address disinformation. So, and this happens also. We can use artificial intelligence to discover posts, for instance, that are produced with using artificial intelligence to help us to identify it. And then what gives me a lot of hope is a lot of the civil society initiatives that are there now helping to debunk these kind of disinformation strategies, also helping, for instance, to develop training modules for high schools, but also for companies, for trade unions, for sports clubs, and whoever. In Finland, they're even doing it in a sauna to actually really train people about how to recognize this information, how to also find trustworthy information. So sort of a lot of the answers actually are already out there. So now I think what we need to do is to scale it up and to amplify it, and because it is possible. People don't want to be fooled. Huh? They want to have access to trustworthy and credible information, and I think we need to give them that kind of freedom.
Fantastic. I'm already starting to feel a bit more optimistic. We've got some time to open up for questions. We've got a few minutes for discussion. If you could very briefly say who you are, keep your question short, and if it's to a particular panelist, please identify that person. The floor is open. We could take a question here. That'd be great.
Thank you very much. My name is Freie. I'm here for Black in Tech Berlin. So my question is to all the panelists, because this is something that has been on my mind quite a lot. You have touched on the fact that the young are really moving towards the right. But what we've also noticed in our work is that it's a lot of the young men. So how are you going to address the young men, be it young men from hard-sphere backgrounds, be it young men from immigrant backgrounds, be it young men in northern Nigeria who are running off to join Boko Haram or ISIS? That is what I'd like to know. We need help for our young men.
Fantastic question. Engaging young men. Who would like to go first? Anna, do you want to jump in?
Ooh, if I had the answer to that one. No, I think it's indeed, and I really also, I appreciate how you framed the question that we have an issue with young men, because in the German public debate, people often suggest we have a problem with young men from a specific region, right? So for instance, from North Africa or the Middle East. And that is really not the case. There seems to be some issue of, yeah, and I think it has, I mean, the explanation is there. I think you've pointed it out, no? Sort of a loss, or I think you've pointed it out, the loss in the social hierarchy, having to deal with all these smart young women who are competitive now. Well, I guess, I mean, one thing to address it is to try to recognize more and to give first economic and social opportunities. I guess that needs to be the starting point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Social and economic opportunities. Carsten, I suppose you're the nearest thing we have to a representative of young men on the panel. So, from a business perspective, any answers to that?
Well, opportunities. I mean, that's, I think, and I mentioned to provide opportunities, have trust in them, don't finger point them, don't blame them right away, take them seriously, treat them as adults. Yeah, and when it comes to those solutions, I mean, if you make the experience that you have debunked a myth, yeah, because you know the right strategy to differentiate things like that, this would do something with you. And literacy, in that sense, any literacy programs, I think, are quite welcome, especially for the digital era and the technologies that are emerging. But yeah, give them self-confidence. Don't give up on them.
In the interest of time, let's take another question from over here, if we can.
Thank you so much for the fantastic panel. My name's Elzan Godlewski. I'm a climate tech investor here in Berlin from Wisconsin, the swing state in the US. So I apologize to everyone. I voted for Kamala. I tried. I really appreciated, Petra, you bringing up these various different innovations in the policy sphere of citizens' assemblies, more representative, participatory kind of tools and innovations. It seems to me, though, that to do these well and right, they often involve a devolution of power of the current existing infrastructure, and that's something we see, writ large, whether we're talking about inequality in the economy, so on. Do you have any specific examples from history that we can kind of look back on how that's worked in the past and how we've been able to manage that power dynamic to make these kinds of tools more widespread? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'm not going to go back into history, if it's okay with you, but just stick with the present and say there's a lot of interest in these innovations also actually from people in practice. So from people who work in the civil service, from people who work in politics. We've got a live politician on the panel. What I would say is that the job that politicians need to do is so incredibly impossible. There are so many things that need to be done that actually we can think very actively with politicians, with civil servants, about which aspects of their job might well be handled by making politics more participatory. Because they are at the moment in a position where they're often criticized for everything. And this is it's not just criticism, it's not just polite criticism, it's serious abuse in very many instances. And the lack of trust in politicians and in political institutions is hurting them as much as it's hurting voters. So in a sense, what we need to do is we need to establish how we can socialize that idea with politicians, work with politicians on how it can help them to innovate, how it can help civil servants to innovate rather than duplicate, which it often does, and how we can make synergies happen between these innovations and mainstream politics.
This has been a brilliant conversation, but we're almost out of time. I'm not going to do justice by trying to summarize what we've heard, but I think, keeping with tradition, it would be worth saying something about what we've heard about how we can bring down the wall of threats to democracy. And I think I said I wanted to keep this positive as well as doom and gloom, given what's happened this week. And I think we've heard a basis for that, not only from the brilliant work that all our panelists are doing, but some of the ideas that they've put forward. We've heard from Anna about how we need to rethink freedom of speech, the way in which corporations and information is captured by a few, and we need to have not just top-down paternalistic responses, but invite all of society to be part of that. We've heard from Petra about the exciting work, research that she's leading around the new Centre for Democratic Resilience, so that the kind of evidence she's brought to bear in this conversation can connect to policymakers and civil society. We've heard from Carsten how business has a role to recognise how important business is to the private sector and act on that. And we've heard from Lora about many ideas about how we understand the problem, how we diagnose the denialism in democratic backsliding, but also the crucial importance of the work that Script and others are doing to better communicate science research and particularly political science. So thank you very much, Anna, Petra, Carsten, Lora, and all of you for joining us for this conversation.